In the quiet spaces of history, there are wars whose echoes never truly fade, yet somehow slip from the world's memory. The Second Sino-Japanese War is one of them. It began not with a grand declaration, but with the uneasy stillness of a continent long pushed to the brink, an age when empires rose, nations fractured, and ordinary people were caught between the gears of destiny. On dusty riverbanks and in cities glowing with neon, millions would soon face choices no human being should ever confront: to flee, to resist, or simply to endure. It was a struggle not only against invasion, but against the weight of a century of humiliation, political betrayal, and civil war. To the west, this conflict is often overshadowed by Normandy and Midway. Yet for Asia, the Second Sino-Japanese War was its crucible, where the future of China, the ambitions of Japan, and the balance of the 20th century were hammered into shape. So we must ask, how did a war so vast, so devastating, become one of the least understood chapters of World War II? Let us return to the beginning, where the storm first gathered over a wounded nation. Long before the Second Sino-Japanese War erupted in gunfire and smoke, its foundations were laid in the slow collapse of an ancient empire. 19th century China, once the confident Middle Kingdom, found itself battered by Western gunboats, unequal treaties, and internal uprisings that hollowed the Qing dynasty from within. The Opium Wars cracked open China's ports. The Taiping Rebellion, deadlier than World War I, tore through its heartland. By the dawn of the 20th century, China was not a nation rising toward modernity, but a fractured landscape, where warlords carved provinces into personal kingdoms and famine shadowed the countryside. From this turmoil emerged a fragile experiment, the Republic of China, its creation fueled by idealism yet undermined by disunity. Sun Yat-sen offered a vision of rejuvenation, but upon his death, the Republic splintered again. Into this fractured world stepped Chiang Kai-shek, a man shaped by hardship and an acute awareness that China stood on a precipice. Trained in Japan, he understood what modernization could yield and what stagnation could destroy. Through the Northern Expedition, he sought to stitch China back together, province by province. Victory brought a semblance of unity, but only in name. Warlords pledged loyalty while keeping armies of their own, and corruption seeped into the new capital at Nanjing. Meanwhile, a new ideological force gained momentum in the countryside. Born from the May 4th movement and nurtured among peasants, the Chinese Communist Party offered promises of land and justice. Mao Zedong, emerging from the ashes of failed uprisings, discovered that true power lay not in cities but in villages. A temporary alliance between nationalists and communists collapsed in blood during the White Terror of 1927, plunging the nation into civil war. The Long March, a retreat across thousands of miles, nearly annihilated the communists, yet it also transformed them into a movement with mythic endurance. While China bled, Japan transformed. The Meiji Restoration had remade the once isolated archipelago into a modern industrial power. Military victories against China in 1895 and Russia in 1905 fueled a belief that Japan was destined to dominate Asia. Ultranationalism flourished, and the military increasingly dictated policy. Resources were scarce, population rising, and the vast lands of China appeared an irresistible answer. Thus came the first major shock, the seizure of Manchuria in 1931. A staged railway explosion provided the pretext. Japanese troops swept across the region with cold precision, establishing the puppet state of Manchukuo. China appealed to the League of Nations, which condemned the invasion but offered no action. Japan withdrew from the League, its ambitions unchecked. For Chiang Kai-shek, the crisis posed a brutal dilemma. Facing both external invasion and internal rebellion, he focused on crushing the communists, believing Japan to be a disease of the skin, while Mao's movement was a disease of the heart. His calculation delayed confrontation, but deepened China's wounds. Only in 1936, when Chiang was kidnapped in the Xi'an incident, was he forced to accept an uneasy united front with Mao Zedong. China would face the looming Japanese invasion of China, not as a unified nation, but as a fractured one, held together by necessity alone. Soon, the gunfire at the Marco Polo Bridge would turn this fragile truce into a war that neither side could escape. The spark that ignited the full fury of the Second Sino-Japanese War came on a humid night in July 1937, at an old stone crossing outside Beijing, the Marco Polo Bridge. It began as confusion in the dock, a missing soldier, a demand to search Chinese territory, a refusal born of pride and distrust. Then came the gunfire. What should have ended with explanations instead opened the gates to the Japanese invasion of China, a campaign the Japanese High Command believed would be swift and decisive. Beijing fell quickly, its ancient walls unable to withstand Japan's modern artillery. But Chiang Kai-shek, long criticized for caution, refused to withdraw into the interior without a stand that could rally the nation. His answer was bold, even desperate. He chose Shanghai, a city of neon lights, foreign concessions, and national pride as the battleground where China would show the world it would not submit. The Battle of Shanghai was unlike anything China had faced before. For 3 bloody months, its narrow alleys and crowded districts became killing grounds. Artillery fire shook the Bund, tanks rolled past rickshaws, and soldiers clung to shattered buildings as waves of reinforcements poured in on both sides. China's troops, many newly trained, charged machine gun nests with rifles and raw determination. Journalists from across the world watched as a modern metropolis transformed into a furnace of urban combat. At first, the ferocity of resistance stunned Japan. But Japan's advantage in armor, training, and naval support eventually turned the tide. When Shanghai fell in November, China lost its best divisions, tens of thousands of its finest soldiers. It was a devastating blow to Chiang Kai-shek, whose hope had been to shock the invader and awaken Western intervention. The world noticed, but it did not act. The fall of Shanghai opened the road to Nanjing, the nationalist capital. What followed remains one of the darkest episodes in the Second Sino-Japanese War. As Chiang ordered a retreat, confusion and broken lines left tens of thousands of troops stranded within the city's walls. When Japanese forces entered in December 1937, discipline collapsed. Rage, indoctrination, and the brutal culture of conquest combined into catastrophe. The Nanjing massacre was not simply an atrocity, it was a seismic wound. Civilians were slaughtered, women assaulted on a scale that defies enumeration, and entire neighborhoods turned to ash. The trauma reshaped national consciousness and forever stained the legacy of the Japanese invasion of China. Survivors spoke of the silence that followed, a silence broken only by fire, by moans of the wounded, by the mourning of a city betrayed. Yet even this horror did not break China. The government retreated inland to Wuhan, which transformed almost overnight into the beating heart of resistance. In 1938, the Battle of Wuhan unfolded across plains, rivers, and mountains. More than 1 million Chinese soldiers, many poorly equipped, all exhausted, held the line against relentless assaults. Engineers destroyed dikes on the Yellow River, unleashing catastrophic floods that killed thousands but slowed Japan's advance. By the time Wuhan fell, Japan had won another victory, but not the victory it needed. Its armies were deeper inside China, its supply lines stretched thin, its ability to force surrender slipping away. The Second Sino-Japanese War had entered its long, grinding crucible. Speed had turned to stalemate. By 1939, the momentum of the Second Sino-Japanese War had begun to shift. What had opened with swift strikes and collapsing cities now hardened into a vast war of attrition, one fought across mountains, river valleys, and countless villages where front lines were little more than shadows. Japan controlled the major urban centers, the railways, the industrial heartlands. Yet what it held on paper was not what it held in reality. The deeper Japanese troops pushed into China, the more elusive victory became. In the countryside, resistance reshaped itself into thousands of small flames. Mao Zedong, long dismissed by many as a fringe revolutionary, understood the terrain in a way the Japanese generals did not. To Mao, the villages were not battlegrounds but reservoirs of endurance. His strategy of guerrilla warfare, the enemy advances, we retreat, turned the vastness of China into a weapon. Supply trains were blown apart in the night, bridges vanished into rivers, patrols disappeared into forests, and each ambush fed a growing belief among peasants that the communists, not the nationalists, would stand with them until the end. In 1940, this strategy reached its peak with the 100 Regiments Offensive. Nearly 400,000 guerrillas struck across northern China, tearing up railroads and forcing Japan to divert precious manpower to defend every line, every bridge, every remote outpost. It was a tactical victory for the communists and a political earthquake. For Chiang Kai-shek, the rise of Mao's influence threatened the very future of the nation he hoped to unify. Yet the Japanese invasion of China left him little room to suppress his rival openly. The uneasy alliance held, but mistrust simmered beneath every military report. Japan responded with brutal countermeasures. The 3 alls, kill all, burn all, loot all, fell upon northern China like a storm. Entire villages vanished. Fields burned to ash. Civilians found themselves trapped between occupiers, guerrillas, and nationalist conscription officers. The war no longer distinguished between soldier and farmer. It became, in every sense, total war. Meanwhile, the nationalist government in Chongqing struggled to hold the nation together. Bombing raids rained fire on the wartime capital, driving families into caves along the cliffs. Inflation ravaged the economy, corruption hollowed the bureaucracy, soldiers went unpaid, and desertion spread. Yet Chiang Kai-shek, stubborn and determined, believed that survival itself was victory, that if China could simply endure, Japan would eventually collapse under the weight of its own ambitions. Japan's answer came in 1944 with Operation Ichigo, its largest offensive of the war. The goal was to connect occupied territories and crush remaining nationalist strongholds. The campaign carved deep into China, capturing cities and inflicting massive losses on Chiang's armies. But even this colossal effort brought Japan no closer to ending the Second Sino-Japanese War. Every mile gained stretched supply lines thinner. Every town taken sparked new resistance. For civilians, the years blurred into a single long agony. Refugees wandered from province to province, carrying what little they could. Famine shadowed the land. The scars of the Nanjing massacre still lingered in memory, as new tragedies unfolded daily. And yet, China did not break. By sheer endurance, by the will of millions who refused to yield, the nation held on, waiting for a moment when the tide of global war would finally turn. As the Second Sino-Japanese War stretched into its grueling middle years, the world watched, but often from a distance that revealed more about global priorities than about China's suffering. The Japanese invasion of China exposed the fragility of the international order built after World War I. When Japan seized Manchuria in 1931, China appealed to the League of Nations, hoping collective security might restrain aggression. But the League's condemnation carried no teeth. No sanctions were imposed, no coalition assembled. In 1933, Japan simply walked out an open demonstration that treaties and diplomatic pressure meant little against determined militarism. The repercussions rippled far beyond Asia. In Europe, Hitler and Mussolini studied Japan's success and drew their own conclusions. Boldness would be met with hesitation, not resistance. The collapse of the League in Asia foreshadowed its impending failure in Europe. For China, the verdict was clearer still. The world would not save them. Yet international alignments were shifting. The Soviet Union, wary of Japanese ambition in Siberia, became China's most significant early supporter. Meanwhile, Germany, once a major advisor to Chiang Kai-shek, pivoted toward Tokyo as part of its anti-communist strategy. Diplomatic ground was moving beneath China's feet, and no alliance seemed guaranteed. For the United States, the Japanese invasion of China posed a moral dilemma, but not yet a call to arms. America clung to isolationism in the 1932, reluctant to entangle itself in another global conflict. Still, reports of atrocities, including the Nanjing massacre, stirred public outrage. Gradually, Washington began supplying loans and limited aid to China, framing its support as a stand against unchecked aggression. But true partnership would only come after the 7th of December 1941, when Japan struck Pearl Harbor and thrust the United States into World War II. Once allied, the American role grew rapidly. Supplies traveled along the Burma Road. Later, aircraft braved the deadly Himalayan airlift known as the Hump. General Joseph Stilwell worked alongside Chiang Kai-shek, though their relationship was fraught with mistrust. U.S. strategists saw China as a vital front tying down Japanese divisions. Chiang saw American aid as essential but insufficient for survival. Meanwhile, Mao Zedong observed the shifts with care, understanding that international support could reshape China's internal balance long after the foreign invader was gone. By the early 1942s, the Second Sino-Japanese War was no longer an isolated conflict. It had become one arm of a global struggle, its outcome intertwined with battles in the Pacific, maneuvers in Europe, and the calculations of every major power. China's agony, once overlooked, was now inseparable from the fate of the world. The end of the Second Sino-Japanese War in 1945 did not feel like triumph so much as exhaustion. After 8 years of devastation, China emerged shattered yet unbroken. The land bore scars that would shape its destiny for generations, cities in ruins, millions dead, countless families erased by famine, displacement, and the brutality of the Japanese invasion of China. Yet survival itself was a victory. a testament to the resilience of a nation that refused to collapse even when its institutions, armies, and alliances were pushed to the brink. For China, the war transformed everything. It strengthened national identity and forged a shared memory of resistance. But it also exposed the deep fractures within the country. The nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek, though internationally recognized as victors, were weakened by corruption, economic strain, and battlefield losses. Meanwhile, the communists, led by Mao Zedong, emerged from the conflict with newfound legitimacy. Their guerrilla networks, forged in the crucible of war, had embedded them deeply into the countryside. As China celebrated the end of foreign aggression, the stage was set for a final internal reckoning, a civil war that would decide the fate of the nation. For Japan, the legacy of the war was equally profound. The early dreams of empire crumbled under the weight of devastation at home and moral catastrophe abroad. Atrocities such as the Nanjing massacre left wounds that continued to challenge relations between Japan and its neighbors. In defeat, Japan confronted the consequences of militarism and the illusions of destiny that had driven its expansion. On the global stage, the war offered a stark lesson. International institutions built on diplomacy alone could not restrain aggressive powers determined to rewrite the world. The failure to stop Japan in the 1930 seconds foreshadowed the failures that would unfold in Europe, and when the world finally acted with American firebombs, Soviet offensives, and the atomic age descending upon Hiroshima and Nagasaki, it revealed how quickly humanity could descend into unprecedented destruction. Yet amid the ashes lies a message that still matters. The Second Sino-Japanese War reminds us that history's greatest turning points are not always the ones most remembered. Sometimes, they are found in places where people endured simply because there was no other choice but to stand and survive. So we must ask, what does this forgotten war teach us about resilience, about power, and about the cost of indifference? And in a world where new tensions rise, are we any closer to learning the lesson that Asia paid for in blood? Let me know your thoughts below, and if you want more deep dives into global military history, be sure to follow along.